Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another discography ranking. Today we will be looking at the albums from American alt-country act Son Volt. Now this is the second of a three-part series concerning the band Uncle Tupelo and its two major offshoots, Son Volt and Wilco. If you haven't already, I would recommend watching the Uncle Tupelo video first and then come back to this one. And if you're watching this video at the time it comes out, the Wilco video will be out shortly, so stay tuned. Son Volt was formed by Jay Farrar in the wake of the band Uncle Tupelo splitting up in mid-1994. Farrar reconnected with former Tupelo drummer Mike Hydorn, who had left the band previously to focus on raising a family, and the two got in contact with Jim and Dave Boquist, brothers from Minneapolis, who both had met Farrar in previous capacities. Jim had played with the singer-songwriter Joe Henry, who had opened for Uncle Tupelo on their last tour. The four musicians began rehearsing and playing shows in both Minneapolis and Farrar's hometown of St. Louis, and recorded their first album in the Minneapolis suburb of Northfield. Signed to Warner Brothers on the back of Uncle Tupelo's hype train, the newly formed Son Volt put out their debut album Trace in September 1995. This was only a few months after Farrar's old bandmate Jeff Tweedy had put out AM, his first record with his new band, Wilco, and the two albums were compared heavily both by critics and by fans. By most critical accounts, though, Son Volt had won the first round of this alt-country heavyweight battle. Trace was massively praised as a continued step forward by Farrar as a songwriter. Son Volt released two more records in the late 90s, Straightaways in 1997 and Wide Swing Tremolo in 1998, and both records received modest praise, although neither ended up being a massive detour stylistically from Trace, and given the massive improvements that Wilco would go through on their records around this time, the band ended up kind of falling in the shadow of Wilco just at least somewhat during that point. And after having recently become a father, Farrar decided to take a step back from intense touring and focus on his home life as well as other musical endeavors. So Son Volt went on an indefinite hiatus in 1999. The next 5 years saw Farrar put out a couple of solo records and do some modest touring as a solo act. In 2004, the band reunited to record the song Sometimes for the Alejandro Escovedo tribute album Por Vida. And Farrar believed that because of the success of that recording session that there was interest in recording a full-length Son Volt reunion album and set things in motion to make that happen. Now, it's not entirely clear why, although it was likely because of contractual disputes and questions about a potential touring schedule, but the other three Son Volt members pulled out of the reunion just before recording started, and Farrar hastily assembled a new lineup of various touring and studio musicians to go through with the project. The resulting album, Okima and the Melody of Riot, came out in 2005 to generally positive reviews, and it kickstarted what ultimately can be viewed as the second era of Son Volt that really has continued until the present day. While some of the musicians from that project still play with Son Volt to this day, like bassist Andrew Duplantis and keyboardist Mark Spencer, for the most part Son Volt has had a somewhat rotating cast of musicians contributing. The focus has always been on Jay Farrar himself, and Son Volt has been the primary vehicle for Farrar as a songwriter. He has not released very many solo records since the early aughts. Most of his songwriting has been focused in these Son Volt records. And these Son Volt records have continued to explore different forms of Americana and country music, whether that's the garage rock of American Central Dust or the West Coast country influences of honky tonk. The band is continuing to tour to this day, and they tend to put out records at a pretty consistent clip every couple of years or so. So given that their last record came out in 2023, I expect we will see a new one sooner rather than later. But for today anyways, we do have 11 studio albums to talk about. I am not including any of Jay Farrar's solo material in this ranking, but I do specifically want to call out his first solo album, 2001's Sebastopol. I think it is absolutely stellar, a take on psychedelic songwriting that I think is by far the most adventurous and kind of just out there thing Farrar has ever done. Now, we'll see when we talk about these Son Volt records that this is somewhat of a relative statement, But fans of Wilco records from that same time period, if you like stuff like Summer Teeth, for instance, will recognize some similarities in what Farrar is trying to do, although I would not go so far as to accuse it of being a ripoff or to accuse Farrar of being, trying to latch on to Wilco's success at that point. These are still unmistakably J. Farrar songs, just with a psychedelic tinge to them, not really the pure kind of psych pop that Jay Bennett was pushing Wilco towards at around that time. I don't think that Farrar has a bad solo record by any means. I think all of them are at least decent, but Sebastopol, I think, stands head and shoulders above everything else, stands above most of what he's done in general, to be honest. And so if you have never heard it, if you've only explored Farrar's stuff with Uncle Tupelo and Sunvolt, definitely check out Sebastopol. I think that's an excellent record. Highly recommend it. But with that said, we have 11 studio albums, so let's go ahead and jump right on in. At number 11, I have 2019's Union. Sunvolt is a very difficult band for me to talk about. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. And one thing that I'm going to emphasize just from the start is you are probably going to hear me say a lot of the same things about a lot of these records. Not because I think they're all identical sounding, but I think the band has a pocket. Jay Farrar as a songwriter has a pocket that he falls into. And for better or for worse, he doesn't steer away from that pocket very much. And so because of that, you are left with some records that are just really difficult to discuss. And I think Union is the most complex one. Do you like Sunvolt? If you like Sunvolt, you probably will like this record. I don't think it strays away from the playbook really at all. The most interesting thing about Union as a concept, I suppose, is that it's trying to be, a commentary on late 2010s politics in America and stuff like that, which, of course, thousands of other artists have tried to do. And Farrar puts his own stamp on it, and, that's fine. Tracks like The 99, Devil May Care, Lady Liberty, certainly, I think, emphasize the symbolism of it all. But I think, by the late 2010s at this point, I think, even for the experimentation that Sunvolt had been doing on some of their late aughts and early 10s records, I think they've settled into a little bit more of a safe space here, stylistically. And I don't know. I don't think this moves the needle much for me personally at all. It sounds okay. It sounds decent enough. And I think fundamentally these are still like good songs. I don't want to accuse Farrar of being a mediocre songwriter, even in this stretch. But this was possibly the point where I, as a listener, was feeling a little bit of fatigue from the Sunvolt formula, as it were. And in that sense, possibly with re-listens, this record will grow on me a little bit, but I don't necessarily expect that this is going to be ever really a favorite of mine in the catalog. It's dated to a certain time period. It has, again, some of the same strengths as other Sunvolt records, but I think it's one of the most unremarkable things they've done. So at the bottom for me, number 11, Union. At number 10, and this could be a little bit controversial because I know some people really like this one, but I have 2009's American Central Dust. So once again, we are throwing back to the late 90s here. And and I say that because he had been doing this before and kind of some of the other mid-aught Sunvolt records. And I don't really know how to articulate it very well, but I don't think the production on this album in particular quite works for the sound that they're trying to go for. I think they're going for something that's a little bit harder edge, kind of like they did on like Wide Swing Tremolo. But the production is very clean. And I think as a result, it doesn't quite have the impact that I think maybe it's going for. That said, I think the core songwriting here is still good. I really like Dynamite, the opening track. Cocaine and Ashes, I think, has a really nice kind of harmony line, some great strings on that one. No Turning Back is good. The closing track, Jukebox of Steel, is good. Push Too Far has some, it's a solidly developing song. I think some of the wordplay on that one kind of caught me off guard as possibly a little bit clunky for my tastes, but I think it's a solid enough track. again, I think maybe this is one where I feel like they are going for a very particular sound and they are going for something different, but it doesn't feel like it's fully invested in that idea. And so because of that, I struggled with this one a little bit more than some of the other Sunvolt records that might even be playing it safe a bit more. So I know some people like this one. Some people even consider this one of the highlights of the Sunvolt catalog, and I understand that, but this was not quite up there for me personally. American Central Dust, my number 10. It's a good album. Union I thought was okay. I think everything else is solidly good from here on out, but just not necessarily a highlight of the catalog for me personally. At number 9, I have 2023's Day of the Doug. Tribute to the songwriter Doug Somm, who is notable to Uncle Tupelo fans. For one thing, Farrar has always kind of extolled his virtues. He's a big fan of Somm as a songwriter. He also appeared on the last Uncle Tupelo record, Anodyne, appeared on the track Give the Keys Back to My Heart on that one. And yeah, I think not being someone who is extremely familiar with Somm as a songwriter, really, I think this is a very effective tribute. It's the most recent Sunvolt record, so there's definitely a little bit of a more weathered sound, perhaps, to Farrar's voice, but I think that works for what it is. Definitely, we're leaning more into the country side of things again here, which a lot of times I think is really a positive for Sunvolt as a whole. When they lean into that countryside, I generally tend to really like it. You have these little voicemail messages that Somm left for Farrar himself that are kind of scattered throughout as kind of linking points. Yeah, and it's nice. Again, not necessarily a ton of like tracks that jumped out to me. Perhaps the first proper track, Sometimes You Gotta Stop Chasing Rainbows, is really nice. But I think, especially for the either fans of Somm himself or the fans of Farrar and Sunvolt, I think there's a catharsis to this album that is really valuable. So again, another one that I think some people might have higher on lists than what I do here, and one that could grow on me over time. But for now, Day of the Doug, it comes in at my number 9, but I've got no real complaints. I think it's a solid record for sure. At number 8, I have 2021's Electro Melodier. In some ways, kind of the same strengths as Day of the Doug, I suppose. I think Farrar's voice, now that he's, in his 50s at this point, has a bit more of a weathered sound, which I really like. I think the tracks themselves, for the most part, they operate in kind of standard Sunvolt territory, I suppose. But I think whether it's Farrar's voice, whether it's maybe the brevity of this record too, it's one of the more concise releases that they put out. I think this one works a little bit better for me than stuff like, let's say, Union does. I am partial to the track Lucky Ones. I think the waltz tempo of that one with that very kind of sweeping organ here is really nice. I think it's one of Farrar's loveliest and sweetest, like, modern day compositions. So that one's really nice. Diamonds and Cigarettes is good too. But again, I think this is another record that I can describe simply by saying if you like Sunvolt, you will probably like this album. It fits into the Farrar pocket very neatly and without much griping or complaining. And you know what? That's just fine. There's a place for it for sure. Electro Melodier, my number 8. I don't have a whole lot more to say about that one, but it's very solid and worth checking out if you like that sort of sound. At number 7, I have 2017's Notes of Blue. So this came out right after Honky Tonk, and Honky Tonk was like a huge pivot into country music. And this record, I think, returns to a more balanced approach, a bit more generally like country rock, alt country, if you will. You definitely get some harder edge moments on here. Tracks like Static and Lost Souls, I think, give you a little bit more grit than the average Sunvolt track does. But you still have, again, some of the really like nice, softer moments here, like the penultimate track, Cairo and Southern. I think that's a really good soft track. And again, I think the brevity of the records at this point is also really kind of helping things, because I know some of the Sunvolt records that were approaching like 50-ish minutes in length or whatever, that at times I felt like they could feel their length a little bit, but I like the decision from Farrar and team, as it were, to make more concise releases. It fits with the sort of old school throwback approach that he's trying to go for. One comparison that I have yet to make that I think is very fucking apparent all the time is how much Farrar evokes like Neil Young. He feels like a Neil Young, Woody Guthrie, like if you put them in a blender and threw them out with a little bit of like garage rock and punk rock influence. That's kind of what Jay Farrar would be like. And I appreciate that commitment to style, that commitment to a particular songwriting approach and sound. And in some of these later records, I mean, he genuinely just really sounds like Neil Young at points, which is kind of cool. But yeah, some good tracks on here. Back Against the Wall, I like. Lost Souls, as I said. Sinking Down is good. And some good tracks on here. Again, I think it doesn't move the needle a whole lot compared to most Sunvolt records, but it's another solid effort. Fits into the catalog pretty nicely. And yeah, Notes of Blue will come in at my number 7. At number 6, I have 1998's Wide Swing Tremolo. Yeah, so this is the last record before their first hiatus. And, it's a return. So it kind of leans more into garage rock textures in some ways. And it in that sense, I think it's a nice kind of pivot from what they were doing on Straightaways, which, while I do prefer that record, I will also admit that record is very much following in the footsteps of Trace. I said already that I thought Farrar has always had a trace of Neil Young in his vocals, and oftentimes more than a trace, but really it's on this record where I think it becomes really, really obvious in like his singing approach. He's definitely getting into that frame of mind. There's also, again, as I said, a little bit of a harder edge sound. I don't think it's quite as different sounding as you might be led to believe it is, but there is a slightly earthier sound to this record that grounds it, and I do like that. The track Straight Face, which opens the record, has a very like aggressive and forward mix that I think is pretty cool. I like the track Medicine Hat is good. I really like the track Flow. I think that one is a solid rock tune. I just think, like I really like this era of Sunvolt. I do. I think the band is sharp. That said, this does to me feel like a band that is running out of ideas to an extent, and it's not hard for me to see why Farrar maybe felt like he'd hit a brick wall with this lineup. Because I do know from my understanding that part of why Farrar decided to put the band on hiatus was because he wasn't necessarily feeling creatively fulfilled, or he felt like he wasn't exploring, like he didn't feel like he could explore all the sounds that he wanted to with the way things were going. So they're not covering a ton of new ground at this point. The returns are still strong, but they are diminishing a little bit. So I think it was in many ways, I think a savvy decision by Farrar to pause the band here, because he would go on to make Sebastopol, and that was a fantastic record. So it shows how many ideas he still had in the tank. But yeah, I still think I prefer this record to a lot of the more recent Sunvolt stuff, just in terms of energy and vibrancy and that sort of thing. But I do think this is a little bit of a step down from the first two records. So Wide Swing Tremolo, still quite a good album for sure. Coming in at my number 6. At number 5, I have 2007's The Search. So this follows the first kind of comeback record from Sunvolt, and I think The Search, compared to the record before, it leans a little bit more into the late 90s Sunvolt sound, a little bit more explicitly here. The tracks here, I think, are murkier and a bit darker than they were on Okima. And I think that works, again, as you see from the ranking, I don't like this one quite as much as I do Okima, but I do think they are pretty successful in exploring that sound, even if they kind of end up just sticking with that sound for the most part for, the subsequent 20 years. The track Action, I think, has a really cool riff to it, really solid guitar sound on that one. I really like the kind of phased backward guitars on Circadian Rhythm. Again, I love when Farrar allows these more non-traditional, occasionally psychedelic elements to enter his production. I think that's really cool when he incorporates that. Always, I think, a highlight of the record when he does. The track Methamphetamine, there's some really cool organ playing on that one. Really like that from Derry de Borgia, I believe is who was playing on that one. The track Highways and Cigarettes, great duet. Shannon McNally singing on that one. And I think she works really well with Farrar on this one. You don't get a ton of like just straight, out and out duets in the Son Volt catalog, but the couple of times that they do happen, I think they work pretty nicely. So yeah, it's a solid, again, throwback to what they'd been doing, 10 years prior. And I think it's ultimately a pretty successful one. So not top shelf Son Volt material, but still a really good record. The Search coming in at my number 5, solid stuff. At number 4, I have 2005's Okima and the Melody of Riot. First record with the new lineup, and the result, and I haven't spotlighted the individual players very much in these records, because again, I see them as, for the most part, musicians who are there to bring Farrar's kind of creative vision into life. And Farrar himself, I think, has even kind of referred to them in much the same way. But I do think they are good players who, contribute a lot here. And this record, I think, leans into more straightforward rock ideas than any of the previous albums. And I do think it serves this well. I think if they had started from the outset by trying to go for a retro sound, trying to throw back to what they were doing 10 years prior, I'm not sure it would have come across as well. But this record sounds pretty fresh, and I like that. Again, Farrar, as lyricist, as songwriter, is still very much in his kind of like preaching mode, right? Like, again, drawing from the generations of protest singers and stuff, he's getting on his soapbox and he's preaching about X, Y, or Z. And I think he's on this record in particular, he is very directly pulling from the works of other notable protest artists that came before. Tracks like Afterglow 61 and Jet Pilot, I think, are very clearly pulling from, again, your Guthries, your Seekers, your Dylans, and stuff like that. Individual lines, it's very prominent. My favorite song on here is actually very clear. It's Six String Belief. Incredible song, one of the best Son Volt tracks, I think. Really satisfying structure here. Love the guitar tone on it, among my favorites of the record. I just think it's stellar. The track World Waits for You as well, closing track. I think that one works really nicely. Very piano-centric song, which you don't get a ton of on Son Volt records. And Farrar is, again, kind of getting into his Neil Young voice a little bit here, which I think serves it well. Plenty of other good songs here as well. This is, again, a really strong record. We're getting into genuinely, I think, great or close to great album territory. Yeah, I think it's a fresh start. I think it's not quite the best of the new lineups records. I think there's one that I prefer just a little bit, but as a sort of return to form, I think Okima succeeds in spades. So Okima and the Melody of Riot coming in at my number 4. Yeah, pretty great album. At number 3, I have 2013's Honky Tonk. Yeah, I color me surprised, I guess. Maybe this is a random choice. I don't know. But as the name suggests, this is the most pure country effort that Son Volt has put out to date. There's all sorts of fiddles and pedal steels on here. It's very clearly, I think, pulling from like West Coast country, like I said, very Bakersfield-esque. And again, maybe it's a byproduct of trying to listen to all these albums in a short period of time, but after hearing a lot of records that rotate around the same kind of 2, maybe 3 different sonic ideas, to hear a record that just like jumps into country music like this felt like a breath of fresh air. It felt like being doused with a really refreshing bucket of water, I suppose. And I think it's stellar. I think the playing on this record is excellent. Excellent stuff. And, you know, I think it's not even just like the sonic palette that I think makes this record succeed. I also think it pushes Farrar into different territory as a lyricist and as a songwriter. Not uncomfortable territory. I'm not saying he hasn't done this type of stuff before and been successful at it. But tracks like Wild Side, tracks like Bakersfield, my favorite song on here might be Angel of the Blues. I think they lean into, you know, sides of Farrar's songwriting that he doesn't get to explore in quite this vein, but I think also, you know, service strengths of his. Whether it's reflecting on kind of general Americana themes, whether it's reflecting on, again, kind of the, you know, the darker sides of like poverty and humanity and things like that, and addiction, of course. Like, you know, you're able to explore that, and to explore that with these textures so distinctly and so thoroughly is really cool. So yeah, I don't know. And it's also, again, a very digestible length too, which I really appreciate. So I don't know how many people rate Honky Tonk as a true highlight of the Son Volt catalog, but for me, it absolutely is. I think this is a great album, And honestly, I almost had it at number 2 as well. But yeah, great stuff. I would say if the alt country thing is not your thing, if you are a little bit more traditional minded, Honky Tonk might be the Son Volt record for you. And frankly, might be the record for you out of all the Uncle Tupelo, Son Volt, Wilco records that we'll be talking about. Yeah, great stuff. Honky Tonk, my number 3. At number 2, I have 1997's Straightaways. It's probably very predictable and not all that surprising that the first 2 Son Volt records are my top 2, and it should not at all be surprising that they are in the order that they're in. But I do think that Straightaways ultimately picks up where Trace left off pretty smoothly. I don't think that the songs on here have quite the same impact that the songs on Trace do. I don't know if that's because I just think they're a weaker crop of songs. I don't know if it's just that, you know, I heard Trace, that record left a big impact on me, and it doesn't leave the same type of impact when you hear it again. But don't take that as a me slagging off this record in any sense either. Some great stuff on here. Caryatid Easy leans pretty heavily into alt rock textures, which is really cool. I think that serves as a really strong opener here. Left to Slide, I think, is excellent. The track Last Minute Shakedown, as far as like the more melancholy side of Farrar, I think that's one of the most successful examples of that on this record. I think that's excellent. Cemetery Savior as well. The track Been Set Free is interesting. Like that one, I think it's somewhat negative reviews compared to the other tracks on this record. Like if I hear one song called out from really this early period of Son Volt in general as being like not great or subpar, It's Been Set Free, I don't know what the fuck people are talking about. I think that's asinine. I think the atmosphere here is killer. I think it's great. Yeah, again, it doesn't leave as much of an impact as Trace does. It does feel like Trace 2.0 in a lot of ways, but I don't also want to let that overshadow the fact that, hey, Trace 2.0 is still probably going to be pretty fucking good. And again, I think Farrar is rarely ever in a position to shine as consistently as he is in these first couple of records. So being able to hear that, being able to hear him feel like this confident, I think, and this kind of, you know, unburdened, you know, this is as successful as he's ever been, really. And getting to hear him in that mode, I think, is really cool. So Straightaways, a great record. My number 2, excellent stuff. If you've heard Trace and you're needing to go to another record, Straightaways, I think, is the very easy choice, and I think it's the absolutely correct choice. Check it out if you haven't. Straightaways, my number 2. But at number 1, I don't think people are going to be very surprised by this. I have 1995's Trace. So the thing about Trace is that I said in the Uncle Tupelo video that Son Volt had at least one record. Both Son Volt and Wilco had at least one record that I prefer to any Uncle Tupelo record. So Wilco we'll get to. But for me, for Son Volt, yeah, I do prefer Trace to every Uncle Tupelo record. and the reason for it is, I think this record is just a fantastic example of taking what Farrar was already doing on Uncle Tupelo and his songwriting, which is already, I mean, it was strong from the outset, but continued to evolve, and just really expanding upon it. And Trace sticks that landing in a way that Wilco's AM really doesn't, which we'll get to. But yeah, it's a remarkably good album. I really was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, since this is the first time I've heard it. I think undoubtedly Farrar's best songs of his career live on here. Again, the lyrics I think are interesting and avoid being cliched, more so than some of the other stuff that he does later on anyways. And the song structures that he offers here, that he puts out here, have a really good sense of like dynamics. Like these songs evolve and they breathe, and I really like that. Windfall, I think, is such a good opener, such a great song, possibly the best on the record. And it sets the tone for everything else as well. The track Tear Stained Eye, there's this very like plaintive banjo in here that I think is absolutely superb. Couple of great up-tempo tracks on here. I think Drown is really good. Catching On, I think, is excellent as well. Yeah, and just it works on the up-tempo songs, and boy, it works with the more plaintive and slower stuff. The track 10 Second News, possibly my favorite Sunvolt song overall. What a sound, oh my god. Just the heavy like acoustic guitars on that track, just it really gives it a sense of weight, it gives it a sense of power, and I really love that. The track Too Early, which is this, a tribute to Townes Van Zandt, who was still alive at the time for the record, but a tribute to a songwriter who, one of the great songwriters ever, who at the time was in not great health. Really melancholy, powerful song with just some great like accordion bits here. That's one other thing too. Like, for as much as I think this record has a fairly consistent instrumental palette, they know how to bring out little moments into the forefront that just kind of catch your ear and really, pull you into the record sonically. And I think so much of that has to, that's credit to all the different players. I'll credit Dan Newton. He's the player of the accordion on there, but credit definitely to, whether that's Dave Boquist, who plays a bunch of different assorted instruments on here, whether that's Eric Haywood on the pedal steel. I think the bass and drum work are, again, I think perfectly fine. They didn't stand out to me on listen, but I think they keep everything in a nice pocket for sure. It's so easy to see how this is the record that people were excited about in 1995. It's so obvious to me that it is. And when I think about, when I think of the term alt country, what does it mean to me? And really, I think it's this record. And I'm not saying that, don't take that as me necessarily saying I think this is the best album, the best alt country album of all time, unquestionably, because I don't necessarily think that. But I think this record typifies the genre in many ways, arguably more than any Uncle Tupelo album. I think there's a mystique here where even if you hadn't heard any Uncle Tupelo records, and maybe especially if you hadn't heard any other Sunvolt records, I think you'd be captivated by Jay Farrar just from this one release alone. And yeah, I don't know. It's stellar stuff. It's brilliant songwriting. It's a brilliant atmosphere. And in a way, I think it makes the eventual outcome, not to continue pitting up Farrar versus Jeff Tweedy or whatever, but it makes the eventual outcome where Wilco is the major band. Wilco is the band that the average person knows, not necessarily Sunvolt. It makes that all the more surprising because holy shit, what a way to start out. Trace, definitely my number one. Easily the best Sunvolt record. Definitely, I think, for me, preferable to any Uncle Tupelo records. And right up there with some of the best alternative rock country records of the 1990s for sure. Trace, my number one. Stellar stuff. If you have not listened to it, check it out. All right, and that concludes this video. So I am very curious to know what your favorite Sunvolt album is. Is it something other than Trace? And if so, let me know. What are your favorite Sunvolt songs? Very curious to know that. And yeah, just, what are your thoughts on Sunvolt in general? I really wanted to really try to encourage people to, listen to them and think about them, because I didn't just want to do videos on Uncle Tupelo and Wilco. That seems, that makes sense for sure. But I think Sunvolt deserved to be talked about in this platform. And even though, I'm not crazy about every Sunvolt record by any means, I still think this was a worthwhile dive, if only for, if nothing else, than for some of the very top records on this list for sure. So let me know if you haven't heard any of these records, give them a shot, and then come back here and let me know what you think. And yeah, stay tuned for the Wilco video, which will be coming out very soon. With that, thanks a lot for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.